One of my best callers on this show is a man who goes by D in Denver. He usually calls in towards the end of the show and gives a very well thought out opinion on multiple topics that were talked about that night. And last week, after another great call from D in Denver, I wrapped up the show, and on my way out of the Mile High Sports Studios, I decided to check my Twitter timeline. To my surprise, I noticed that Colin Daniels from SouthStandsDenver.com was going on an internet radio show hosted by no other than my caller, D in Denver. Considering that I had just been on the South Stands podcast a week earlier and have really started to dig Colin's site, I decided to listen to what he was going to say on a show hosted by my awesome caller, right? It's a no-brainer. The show was great. Colin and D were touching on a number of local sports topics, and eventually I said to myself, I got to chat with these guys, you know? So on my way home, I picked up my cell phone, and this time became D in Denver's caller on his internet radio show. And as we're talking about George Karl and his legacy, I started thinking about what Colin and D were saying. Is he a top 10 coach of all time? Is he a current top 5? I'm a football guy, so I equate all things in life to the gridiron. Using that mindset, I thought of what would happen in football if a coach had similar regular season success to George Karl, but never got it done in the playoffs. And then it hit me. George Karl is Marty Schottenheimer. Great coaches that can quickly turn any team with talent into a team that nobody in the league wants to play. Guys that believe in basics and fundamentals, but can have their basic thinking exposed by great players and great coaches when it's all on the line. Guys who are better around a group of players than a star player. Lastly, guys who become engulfed in frantic mistakes and melt when the stakes are at their highest. Is this the infinite future of the Nuggets as long as George Karl is the head honcho, everybody? I don't know. But I went ahead and I dug into some history of these coaches, and I started studying the two, George Karl and Marty Schottenheimer. I was blown away by the similarities. Karl has one thing that separates him from Marty, folks, which is a championship appearance. He went to the NBA Finals one time. But other than that, these coaches are two ex-players that are cut from the same cloth. Karl was drafted in 1973 and ended up playing in the ABA, an exciting league that was looked at as the little brother of the NBA. Marty Schottenheimer was drafted in the AFL in 65, an exciting league that was looked at as the little brother of the NFL. Both Marty and George were average-sized players at their position with no huge athletic advantage over their opponents. They survived by being fundamentally sound and playing smart. And they took that mindset into their coaching careers. Karl played professionally for 5 years. Marty played for 6. Careers about the same time. Both started their head coaching careers in the city of Cleveland. They both bounced from team to team as the early playoffs exits wore thin in every city that they were in. One of the most astounding statistics is how similar their regular season numbers actually are. Both coaches have more than 20 years of experience under their belts. Marty has a regular season winning percentage of 61%, and George is right behind him with a regular season winning percentage of 60%. Almost the same exact winning percentage for the regular season for both coaches. These coaches have guided many very good teams, guys, Marty Schottenheimer and George Karl, but never great teams. They've never had great teams. Only very good teams. Marty's Chiefs and Browns teams in the 80s and 90s were a force, but never looked at as elite or a perennial championship contender. They made the playoffs every year and even went to a few championship games only to lose every time. The words used when describing Marty Schottenheimer's teams: tough, smart, execution, well-coached, teamwork. George Karl's Seattle and Denver teams, they've been consistent playoff teams. They've been consistent playoff teams as well, just like Marty's. But like Marty's teams, they went to the playoffs every year only to lose to a team that is considered elite. Just like Marty's teams. Words used to describe George Karl's teams: tough, smart, execution, well-coached, teamwork. Do you see a pattern there? What's really funny is that neither of these coaches have ever won anything. But despite that, you could still put up legitimate arguments that both are Hall of Fame contention. Only 4 other coaches in NFL history have won more games than Marty Schottenheimer. Only 9 other coaches in NBA history have won more games than George Karl. Those guys sit in a class with the greatest of the greatest of the great, and both have almost identical stories. But the bottom line is that when it's time to win a championship, ladies and gentlemen, or even win the game that gets you there, these guys just can't get it done. Sure, George Karl has reached the finals once in 23 years. And yes, all Marty's Browns team had to do was stop the Broncos from driving a miracle 98 yards, and they were in the biggest game on earth. But at the end of the day, they both have 0 rings and 0 trophies. Listen, George Karl is a great coach, and you can always count on being competitive with him around. But if you want to win a championship, you got the wrong guy, everybody. George Karl is Marty Schottenheimer.